There is a kind of man the modern world has forgotten how to make. Not the man who talks about sacrifice, not the man who posts about discipline, the man who was forged in fire so complete, so total, that by the time it was over, he could no longer remember what he had felt like before the burning began. Sparta made that man, and then Sparta destroyed him. This is the story of Nicias, a warrior, a husband, a father, a servant of the state so loyal, so absolute, that his loyalty became the very instrument of his undoing. This is not a story about battles. It is not a story about glory. It is a story about what a man loses when he gives everything to a system that was never designed to give anything back. It begins as all Spartan stories begin, with fire. The year is 490 BC. The hills above Sparta are dry and brown in the late summer heat, and the cicadas are screaming in the olive trees the way they always scream at the end of things. Nicias is 18 years old, and he is standing in the training yard for the last time. He does not know it is the last time. He thinks it is a beginning. His body is a monument to 12 years of systematic destruction and reconstruction. The agoge began when he was 7, on a morning he still remembers with strange clarity, his mother standing at the door of their stone house with her hands folded in front of her face composed into the expression every Spartan mother practiced until it became true. She did not weep. She did not reach for him. She said what was expected. And then she closed the door. For 12 years after that door closed, Nicias learned what it meant to be Spartan. He slept on reeds. He cut himself from the banks of the Eurotas River, the stalks sharp enough to draw blood from his palms when he harvested them, sharp enough to cut into his back when he lay down on them at night. He wore one garment through summer and winter, through rain and frost, through the kind of cold that settles into the bones of young boys and teaches them permanently that their bodies are not their own. He was hungry every single day for 12 years. Not the hunger of an inconvenient afternoon, but the grinding mathematical hunger of a state that had calculated the precise minimum caloric intake required to keep a boy alive, while simultaneously teaching him that need itself was weakness. He stole food because the agoge required it, not because the state approved of theft, but because it approved of cunning. The boy who stole and was not caught was learning something valuable. The boy who stole and was caught was beaten not for the theft, but for the failure of concealment. Nicias was rarely caught. By 18, he had been beaten more times than he could count. He had slept in the open air in temperatures that killed livestock. He had run until tendons snapped and been ordered to run further. He had fought boys older and larger than himself with a ferocity that surprised even his instructors, not because he was naturally violent, but because he understood in the wordless way that bodies understand things before minds do, that the only way out was through. Now he stands in the training yard with the other young men who have surrounded, and Counselor Brennus is walking the line. Brennus is 55 years old in 490 BC, and he carries his age the way Sparta intended, like armor rather than burden. His face is a map of every campaign he has survived, a landscape of scar tissue and deep lines and eyes that have looked at death so many times they have developed a kind of professional calm in its presence. He is not cruel in the way that petty men are cruel. He is something more dangerous. He is a true believer. He walks the line of 18-year-old men and says nothing for a long time. Then he stops in front of Nicias. Nicias does not flinch. He has learned not to flinch. Brennus looks at him with the assessment of a craftsman examining finished work, calculating, satisfied. Nicias, he says, son of Philippos. Yes, counselor. Your father died at Marathon. Yes, counselor. He died well. Yes, counselor. Brennus nods slowly. There is something in his eyes that might be approval, or might be the memory of Philippos, who was apparently also worth looking at with those flat, assessing eyes. Sparta expects you to do the same. I know, counselor. And Nicias means it. He means it with every fiber of his constructed body, with every scar and every healed break, and every morning he ran through frost on empty feet. He means it the way only a man who has been systematically emptied of everything else can mean something. He has no possessions. He has no family in the ordinary sense. He has no private ambitions, no secret desires, no interior life that has not been examined and approved by the state. What he has is this: the absolute, clean, uncomplicated certainty that Sparta is worth dying for. He will spend the next 24 years discovering what that certainty costs. The marriage to Kara happens 6 months after graduation, arranged by the magistrates with the efficiency of a military supply allocation. Nikias is 19. Kara is 17. They meet for the first time at the ceremony itself. She is not beautiful in the way that word is used carelessly. She is something better. She is strong visibly and architecturally strong, with the posture of a woman who has spent her childhood running and wrestling and throwing javelins, not for the joy of it, but because the state required her body to be capable of producing warriors. Her jaw is set. Her eyes are the color of the hills in winter. She looks at Nekias the way he looks at her, with the calm, comprehensive assessment of two people who have been trained to evaluate physical specimens. They do not speak much at the ceremony. There is not much to say. The magistrate pronounces them bound. Witnesses record the union. The state notes in its ledgers that two lineages of acceptable genetic quality have been formally merged in service of Spartan continuity. That night, Nikias leaves the barracks before dawn and walks through the dark streets to the small stone house where Kara now lives. He does what is required, and before the sky begins to lighten, before the city stirs and the risk of being seen returning from a wife's house becomes a mark of shameful domestic attachment, he walks back to the barracks alone. He does this for months, always in darkness, always brief, always efficient. He tells himself this is correct. He tells himself the absence of sentiment is strength. He has been told this so many times and by so many authoritative voices that it has become indistinguishable from his own thought. But there is one morning, a single morning in the cold weeks of early spring, when he arrives at Kara's house earlier than usual and finds her awake sitting at the small table with a clay cup of warm water in her hands, watching the darkness outside the window. She does not startle when he enters. She simply looks at him with those winter-colored eyes and says quietly, not as invitation, but as simple fact, you can sit if you want. He sits. She does not offer the cup, but she does not move away from the table either. They sit in silence for perhaps 20 minutes while the darkness outside very slowly begins to become gray, and Nikias, who has not sat in comfortable silence with another human being since he was 7 years old, feels something shift in his chest that he has no vocabulary to describe. Then the sky lightens enough to matter, and he goes back to the barracks. He does not allow himself to think about that morning for a long time. Eudes is born in 488 BC, when Nikias is 20. The birth is reported to him by a messenger who finds him on the practice field, delivers the information with military brevity, and departs. Nikias finishes his drill. Then he walks to the house where Kara is recovering and looks at the infant for the first time. The child is perfect. This is not sentiment. This is the objective assessment of a man trained to evaluate physical specimens, and the specimen in question meets every standard. Good lungs evidenced by the volume of his protests, straight limbs, solid frame, eyes that focus with unusual steadiness for a newborn. Nikias feels something he will not name. 3 days later, in accordance with Spartan law and custom, in the absolute authority of the Drausia, he wraps Eudes in a plain cloth and carries him to the Lesh, the gathering hall where Councillor Brennus and the other elders wait. He does this himself. He does not send a servant or ask Kara to do it. He carries the child himself because he believes this is correct, because he believes that a Spartan man should look directly at the things that matter rather than arranging their management by proxy. He believes this is strength. Brennus examines the infant with the same flat professionalism with which he examined Nikias 2 years ago in the training yard. He checks the spine, the limbs, the cry, the eyes. He confers briefly with the other elders in voices too low to hear. Then he hands the child back. He will do, Brennus says. Nikias nods. He walks home with Eudes in his arms and hands the child to Kara, who takes him with an expression that Nikias does not look at too closely. He goes back to the barracks before dark. Lycus is waiting for him on the steps, as Lycus usually is sitting with his long legs extended and his arms resting on his knees, watching the street with the alert expression of a man trained from childhood to treat every environment as a potential combat zone. Lycus is also 18, also a graduate of the most recent Ogoji cohort, and he is the closest thing to a friend that Spartan life permits. They are not friends in the way the word implies elsewhere in Greece. They do not discuss philosophy or share ambitions. But they have slept in the same barracks for 12 years, and that accumulation of parallel suffering creates something, if not friendship exactly, then its Spartan equivalent, a form of trust built not on affection, but on the knowledge that the man beside you has been tested by the same fires and did not break. Lycus has a son too, born 2 weeks before Eudes, a boy named Aaron. He passed, Nicias says, sitting down beside him. Mine too, Lycus says. They sit in silence for a while. I carried him myself, Nicias says. Lycus looks at him. Why'd you say it? Nicias thinks about it. It seemed right. Lycus nods slowly. He is quiet for another long moment. Then what did it feel like carrying him? Nicias considers this question more carefully than he would like to. It felt like carrying something important. Yes, Lycus says. Just that. Yes. Neither of them says anything else. The stars come out over Sparta, and two young warriors sit on the steps of a barracks and think about their sons, and neither of them has the language to say what they are thinking because the language was taken from them at age 7 and was never returned. 2 years later, Nicias is summoned to a meeting with one of the magistrates, a man named Dion, who handles the administrative machinery of what Sparta calls civic reproduction management. Dion is brisk and practical and entirely without embarrassment, because in his world, there is nothing to be embarrassed about. There is a warrior, Dion explains, a man named Calix, strong enough, loyal enough, adequate in every measurable respect. But Calix's wife has produced one child who survived the Lesh inspection and two who did not. The Gerousia has assessed the bloodline and determined that the problem is generational, not individual, that the genetic inheritance of Calix's particular line requires supplementation from a stronger source. Nicias listens to this. Calix has agreed, Dion continues. It is considered an honor in his household. Nicias's lineage, his own demonstrated qualities, his father's record at Marathon, all of these make him an appropriate contributor. The contribution will be made on a schedule Dion will provide. Calix's wife is named Petra. Nicias says nothing for a moment. Then he says, does Petra agree? Dion looks at him with the mild confusion of a man who has been asked whether a plow agrees to plow. The household has agreed, he says. Nicias nods. He takes the schedule. He walks out. On the way back to the barracks, he passes Lycus in the street. Lycus looks at his face. What happened? Lycus says. Nicias tells him. Lycus is quiet for a moment. Then he says carefully, how do you feel about it? It's my civic duty. That's not what I asked. Nicias looks at his friend. In 12 years of barracks life and a further 2 years of service, Lycus has asked him perhaps 100 questions. Most of them were tactical or practical. This one is neither. Nicias is not sure he has been asked a question like this since he was 7 years old and still lived in a house with his mother back when questions like that were still considered appropriate. I don't know, Nicias says finally. And because this is Lycus, and because the stars are out again and the street is empty, I don't know how I feel about any of it. Lycus nods. He looks away down the street toward the dark hills. There is something working behind his eyes, something that has been working there for months, though Nicias has not yet learned to read it. Sparta comes first, Lycus says quietly, not as conviction, as a test of the words in his own mouth. Yes, Nicias says automatically. Sparta comes first. Lycus nods again, slowly, as though Nicias has confirmed something he was hoping would be contradicted. Get some sleep, he says and walks away. The words stay with Nicias, not the content of them, which is simply the oldest truth of their world, but the way Lycus said them with the careful measuring tone of a man calculating the distance between what he believes and what he is willing to keep believing. He does not understand that tone yet. He will. The year is 481 BC. Nicias is 27 years old, and he is standing in the courtyard of his wife's house at dawn on the morning that will end the first and only life his son has ever known. Eudes is 7 years old. He stands in the courtyard with his small bundle of approved possessions, which is to say almost nothing, and he is looking at his father with the expression of a child who has been prepared for this moment by a lifetime of preparation, and still finds on the morning of it that the preparation was not quite sufficient. Nicias looks at his son. He has seen Eudes perhaps 40 times in 7 years. This is not unusual for Sparta. This is in fact the system functioning exactly as designed because sustained contact between parents and children creates the kind of attachment that weakens loyalty to the state. Nicias knows this. He has always known this. He has always believed it. He looks at Eudes, and his son looks back at him, and Nicaeus feels something in his chest deep in the structural material of the man he has spent 20 years constructing, something that feels less like an emotion and more like a load-bearing wall beginning very quietly, very slowly to develop its first crack. "You know what this is," Nicaeus says. "Yes, father. It is not a punishment. I know. It is the making of you." Eudes nods. He is 7. His jaw is set in a way that reminds Nicaeus of Kara, of that morning at the table with the clay cup of warm water, of the face of a person who has learned very young that composure is a form of armor. He is his mother's son in this, which means he is Sparta's child, which means he is in the only way that matters Nicias's son entirely. Nicias places his hand briefly on the boy's head, just for a moment, just the weight of a hand, no more than that. Then he steps back, and the state's men come forward, and Eudes walks away with them without looking back. Nicias stands in the courtyard until they are out of sight. He does not allow the wall to crack. He has built himself too well for that, but he is aware for the first time of the effort required to hold it. He goes back to the barracks. He does not tell anyone about the hand on the boy's head. For 2 years after that morning, the life of Sparta continues its ancient rhythms. Nicias drills, he trains, he fulfills his civic obligations with the efficiency of a man who has replaced feeling with function so thoroughly that sometimes in the gray hours before dawn, when the barracks are still and the other men are sleeping, he is not entirely sure where the mechanism ends and the person begins. But Lycus is changing. It happens gradually in the way that a man who has decided something changes before he has admitted to himself that he has decided it. He begins missing optional drills. He begins asking questions in briefings, not tactical questions, the kind that demonstrate military intelligence, but philosophical ones, the kind that demonstrate a mind pulling at the foundations of its own architecture. Why does the state require this particular sacrifice and not another? Who decided the inspection standards, and by what authority? What would Sparta be if it had chosen differently at the beginning? These are not Spartan questions. Spartan questions are operational. These are the questions of a man who has begun quietly and perhaps irreversibly to step outside the system that built him. Nicias notices. He says nothing because saying something would require him to have an opinion about what he is seeing, and having an opinion would require him to examine his own foundations alongside Lycus's, and he is not ready for that. One evening, Lycus finds him on the practice ground, after hours, and sits beside him on the stone bench without asking. "I'm done," Lycus says. Nicias looks at him. "Not today, not tomorrow, but I'm done." He looks out at the empty training ground, the packed earth worn smooth by decades of men being made into instruments. "Aaron goes in next year, 7 years old, and I keep thinking about what we said that night, that it felt like carrying something important." "It is important," Nicias says, "to Sparta." "To Sparta," Lycus repeats. "Yes, Sparta comes first. That's what you said. That's what we both said." He pauses. "I don't believe it anymore." Nicias is quiet for a long time. The stars are coming out, the same stars that came out the night they sat on the barrack steps and talked about their sons without having the words for what they were feeling. "What will you do?" Nicias says finally. "I don't know yet," Lycus says, "but I wanted you to know. Before." He stands up and walks away, and Nicias sits on the stone bench in the growing dark, and he does not follow him, and he does not report him, and he tells himself this is because there is nothing yet to report, that a man's private doubts are not a crime, that the words spoken between two warriors on an empty practice ground in the dark are not the business of the Gerousia. He tells himself this. He is not entirely sure he believes it. Kara is sick for the first time in the winter of 478 BC. It is not serious at first. A cough that lingers. A pallor that concerns her neighbors, but not initially the physicians who attend to Spartan women with the same detached professionalism with which veterinarians attend to horses. She is strong, they say. She will recover. Women of her constitution are not susceptible to ordinary illness. Nicaeus is informed by the same messenger system that informed him of Eudys's birth. The message is brief. His wife is unwell. She is being attended to. He should be informed. He is on the training grounds when he receives this. He finishes his session, then he walks to the administration building and submits a formal request to his commanding officer for temporary leave to attend to his wife's illness. The request is returned the following morning with a single word written across it: denied. The reason is not given. Reasons are not required. His duty to the state supersedes his duty to his household. This is not an injustice. This is not even a rule. It is simply the nature of things in a world where the state is the only category that ultimately matters. Nikias holds the returned request in his hands. He looks at the word written across it. He puts it down. He does not submit the request again. Over the following weeks, he receives irregular updates through the household network. She is the same. She is worse. She is the same again. The physicians are adjusting their treatments. She is eating less. She is asking after Eudes. Nikias trains every day. He does his drills with the same precision, the same economy of motion, the same professional ferocity that has made him one of the more respected warriors in his cohort. He eats his meals. He sleeps his hours. He fulfills the duty of civic reproduction on the schedule Dion's office provides. And then one morning a different messenger comes. Not the household network this time. A direct message from the magistrate's office, which means it is official, which means it is final. Kara, wife of Nikias, daughter of Teucer, died in the early hours of the morning. She was buried according to Spartan custom. The household is in order. Nikias's presence at the burial was not required as he was in active service. Nikias reads the message on the training ground standing in the same posture he always stands in, with the same set of his jaw and the same flat depth of his eyes. A man standing 10 feet away watching him would see nothing change, but something changes. It changes the way a dam changes when the fracture that has been growing for a decade finally reaches the point where the structure can no longer distribute the stress. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just a shift in the internal architecture, quiet and permanent and absolute, that changes the way everything downstream will flow from this point forward. He folds the message. He puts it in his belt. He finishes his drill. That evening, for the first time in his adult life, Nikias sits outside the barracks alone and does not perform any useful function. He simply sits. He looks at the hills. He thinks about Kara at the table with the clay cup of warm water in her hands, the darkness outside the window, the 20 minutes of silence that was the only intimate thing they ever shared. He thinks about how little that was. He thinks about how much it was. He does not grieve because Sparta has no mechanism for grief, and he has no mechanism that Sparta did not build. But he sits very still in the growing dark, and he allows himself for the first time since he was a child to want something that the state cannot provide. He wants to have sat at that table more often. 2 years later, in 476 BC, Eudes is permitted a visit home. This happens rarely in the agoge, these brief returns, and they are not sentimental occasions. They are assessments, opportunities for the family to observe the progress of their contribution to Sparta's warrior class. Eudes is 12 years old. He walks into the house where Nikias is waiting, and he stands at attention with the automatic posture of a boy who has been standing at attention for 5 years, and for whom the relaxed stance has become the unusual one. He is thinner than Nikias expected. His eyes are older than 12 in the way that agoge boys' eyes are always older than their years, not with wisdom exactly, but with the gravity of someone who has learned that comfort is not coming. Father, Eudes says, and then corrects himself. Sparta does not really use the word father in formal settings, and formal is the only setting Eudes now inhabits. Sir, the word lands on Nikias like a stone dropped from a great height. Eudes, he says. They sit across a table from each other. Not the same table where Kara used to sit, that table is gone. Now the house has been reconfigured by official necessity. A different table. They sit at it the way two men sit when they have been told by the same authority to produce an interaction. And Nikias looks at his son, and his son looks back at him, and Nikias understands with a clarity that is almost physical that the boy across from him does not know him. Not in the way that matters, not the way a son knows a father. Nikias thinks about what to say. He has been trained for 12 years in the agoge and another 10 in active service. And in all of that training, there was not a single lesson on how to speak to a child who has been made to call you sir. He picks up a short blade from the table, a practice knife, and holds it out to Eudes. Show me your grip, he says. Eudes takes the knife. His grip is good. It is in fact better than good. The boy's hands know what they are doing. Your instructors have been thorough, Nikias says. Yes, sir. They spend 2 hours this way, Nikias asking about training, Eudes answering with the clipped efficiency of a soldier reporting to a commanding officer. At no point does Eudes ask about his mother. Whether he has been told, whether he already knew, whether Sparta's machinery of information has made the official notification in its official way, Nicias does not know. He does not ask. This too is Sparta. This too is the system functioning as designed. When the visit ends and Eudes stands to leave, he pauses at the door. "Sir," he says. "Yes." Eudes appears to consider something. Then whatever it is, he decides against it. "Nothing," he says. "Thank you for the session." He leaves. Nicias sits at the table for a long time after that. He thinks about the practice knife, about the boy's grip, about the 2 hours of operational conversation that substituted for every conversation they were never permitted to have. He thinks about Calix and Petra, about the children he fathered in service of another man's bloodline. Children who are growing up somewhere in this city calling someone else their children. He will never recognize in the street children who are his in the biological sense and utterly not his in every sense that matters. He thinks about what the state has made of him and through him, and he sits with all of it at the table in the empty house and finds at the end of the sitting no resolution, only inventory. The confrontation with Brennus happens in 474 BC, when Nicias is 34 years old and has reached the point that the system's designers presumably anticipated, the point at which a man has given enough that the giving begins to feel less like devotion and more like bleeding. He requests a formal audience. Brennus receives him in the council chamber, a stone room of deliberate austerity with a small fire and 2 chairs, and the kind of silence that accumulates in rooms where power has been exercised for a long time. Nicias sits down across from Brennus, who is 69 years old now, and carries the additional years with the settled permanence of a man who has never once questioned whether the life he built was the right one. "I want to be released from the reproductive obligation," Nicias says. He has practiced this sentence. It comes out level. Brennus looks at him. "Calix's wife," Nicias says. "The arrangement, I want it to end." "You have fulfilled 4 cycles," Brennus says. "There may be additional need for your contribution. I want it to end." The fire between them is small and businesslike. Brennus studies Nicias with those flat professional eyes. "Tell me why woman," but he says, not as a concession, as an inquiry. Nicias thinks about the honest answer. The honest answer involves a table and a clay cup and a word written on a returned leave request in a 12-year-old boy with a soldier's grip in a stranger's eyes. The honest answer is not Spartan. "Because I am tired," he says instead. "Tired," Brennus repeats. "Yes." Brennus is quiet for a moment. The fire moves. "Do you know what you are, Nicias?" "I am a warrior of Sparta." "You are an instrument of Sparta," Brennus says, not unkindly, almost gently, in the way that men who have never questioned their own premises are sometimes gentle because they genuinely cannot comprehend why the person in front of them is troubled by something so self-evident. Instruments do not tire, they do not want. They function or they do not function. If you are no longer functioning adequately, that is a matter for the Gerousia to assess, but instruments do not come to councils requesting changes to their operational parameters because they have feelings about their deployment. Nicias looks at him. "I see." "I don't think you do," Brennus says. "I think you see it as coldness, as indifference to your particular situation. But you should understand something, Nicias. This is not indifference. This is the price of what we built here. Every man in this city has paid it, or will pay it, or has refused to acknowledge that it is being paid. You are not special in your suffering. You are not unique in what you have lost. You are Spartan, which means your losses are the foundation of our strength." Nicias stands up. "Thank you, counselor," he says. He walks out. He is halfway down the street when a messenger finds him. "Lycus has been arrested. The charge is desertion of civic duty. The hearing is tomorrow." Nicias is requested to appear as a character witness. He sits alone that night in the barracks, and he thinks about what Lycus said on the practice ground 2 years ago. "I'm done." And before that, in the street after the meeting with Dion, Sparta comes first. Said with the measuring tone of a man calculating the distance between what he believes and what he is willing to keep believing. Nicias said it back to him automatically. Yes, Sparta comes first. And now Lycus has made his calculation. And the answer he arrived at is the one that Nicias has been refusing to look at directly for 2 years. The answer that lives on the other side of all the questions Lycus was asking at briefings, all the philosophical, pulling at foundations that Nicias watched and said nothing about. He goes to the hearing. The evidence is clear. Lycus ran and was caught, and the logic of the system that shaped both men is inexorable in what it requires next. The Gerousia's decision is delivered in the flat administrative language of institutional inevitability. The sentence is death. The execution is to be carried out by a warrior of demonstrated loyalty whose personal connection to the convicted will serve as evidence of the system's completeness, its total penetration of every human bond. The name selected is Nicias. He stands in the execution yard and Lycus is brought out, and Lycus looks at him with the eyes of a man who has known this was coming, who perhaps planned it this way, who perhaps chose to be caught rather than to keep running, because he understood that a Spartan who runs is not actually free, only absent. Say it, Lycus says quietly. Nicias looks at him. You said it in the street, after Dion's meeting. I told you I was losing faith and you said it straight back to me without thinking. Sparta comes first. Lycus holds his gaze. Say it now. The yard is quiet. The officials are watching. The mechanism of the state is fully assembled and fully operational and waiting for Nicias to be what he has always been. He does what is required. He walks back to the barracks in the early evening light, and that night he lies on his bed in the dark and stares at the ceiling. He thinks about the words. He thinks about the first time Lycus said them, testing them in his mouth on the dark street. He thinks about how automatically they came out of his own mouth, the way a trained reflex comes before a thought arrives. He thinks about Lycus's face when he said them in the execution yard, and the expression there that was not surprise, that was something closer to a terrible confirmation. For the first time in his adult life, Nicias, warrior of Sparta, instrument of the Gerousia, son of Philippos, who died while at Marathon, does not sleep. He lies awake and stares at the ceiling and understands in the darkness that the thing he killed in that yard today was not only Lycus, Bridge. The years between are not empty, but they are hollowed. Nicias continues to function because function is the only mode he has ever been given. He drills, he serves. He fulfills the last cycles of his reproductive obligation, and then without ceremony or acknowledgement, the schedule from Dion's office simply stops arriving. He does not know if Calix's household finally produced what the Gerousia required, or if the arrangement was simply concluded by bureaucratic determination. He is not told. He does not ask. He accepts the silence the way he has accepted everything the state has given and withheld as simply the nature of things. But something is different in those years, different in the way that a landscape is different. After a flood not visibly transformed, the hills still there, the river still running, but the topsoil shifted, the roots exposed in places they were not exposed before. Nicias still says what is required when things are required to be said. He still stands where he is ordered to stand. He still carries the posture and the reflexes and the thousand small behavioral signatures of a man in whom Sparta has done its finest work. But he has stopped believing that the work was done on his behalf. This is the thing that changes between the execution yard in 473 BC and the autumn morning in 466 BC, when Eudes walks back through the city gate. Not his loyalty, which is structural, now built into him below the level of choice. Not his capability, which the body maintains through habit long after the spirit has asked its hard questions. What changes is his certainty. The absolute, clean, uncomplicated certainty that Sparta is worth dying for has become something more complicated. Worth dying for, perhaps. He no longer knows. Worth living for the way he has lived, in the spaces between duties in the dark before dawn, in the 2 hours at a table with a son who called him sir, that he is no longer sure about at all. The year is 466 BC. Nicias is 42 years old. His body still functions with the precision of its engineering, though the engineering shows its age now in the way that all structures show age in the places where the repairs have been repaired, in the slight deliberateness of movements that were once automatic. Eudes comes home from his first major campaign on a morning in early autumn when the light over the Eurotas Valley is the color of old bronze. He is 22 years old, and he is by every measurable standard exactly what Sparta intended him to be. Nicias watches him walk through the gate. The young man moving toward him carries himself with the economy of a trained warrior. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative, every movement calibrated to purpose. His face is already acquiring the vertical lines that extended vigilance carves into young faces. His eyes hold the depth of a man who has processed violence by placing it in the correct administrative category of his interior life and moving on. He, as Nikias realizes with a shock that is almost physical looking at himself. 20 years ago, before Kara, before the denied leave request, before the table with the clay cup, before the words sir. Father Eudes says, not sir, father. Whether this is a deliberate choice or simply the appropriate register for the formal return of a soldier to his family unit, Nikias cannot determine. Eudes, he says, they eat together that evening, the first meal they have shared since Eudes's single permitted visit at age 12. Nikias has had a decade to prepare something to say, and in all that decade he has not prepared anything, because preparation implies expectation, and expectation implies attachment, and attachment implies all the things that the system built into the bones of both men was specifically designed to prevent. The campaign, Nikias says, successful. Eudes says, we took the objectives. Casualties. Within acceptable parameters. Nikias nods. He looks at his son eating across the table with the efficient automatic movements of a man who refuels rather than dines, and he thinks about Kara as he has thought about Kara with increasing frequency in the years since her death, not with grief exactly because he was never given the time or the permission to grieve, but with a kind of slow archaeological curiosity about a lost world. What would it have been like? What would the three of them have been in a different city under a different logic? I want to tell you something, Nikias says. Eudes looks at him. About your mother. The expression on Eudes's face shifts by a degree that only a man who has been studying it for 22 years could detect. She died while you were on campaign, he says. I was informed. I know, that's not what I want to tell you. Eudes waits. There was a morning, Nikias says. He stops. He is not good at this. He has never been trained for this, and the untrained version of him that would have been good at it was handed to the state at age 7 and largely disassembled. But he continues, before you were born, I arrived at the house early before she expected me. She was awake, sitting at the table. She had warm water in a cup. It was cold outside. She said I could sit. Eudes is very still. We sat for about 20 minutes, not talking, just sitting. And then I left because it was getting light. I went back to the barracks. I never sat with her like that again. I never let myself, because I had been told, we had both been told, that sitting like that, being in a room with someone without purpose, was weakness, was attachment, was the thing that makes a man less effective as an instrument. He pauses. It was not weakness, he says. I know that now. I have known it for a long time. I simply had no one to say it to. Eudes looks at his father for a long moment. His face is the face of a man receiving information that is structurally incompatible with the building he has been living in for 22 years. He does not know what to do with it. The incompatibility is too large for one dinner table to resolve. But he does not look away, and he does not dismiss it. And for Nikias, who expected nothing, this is an extraordinary amount. The message from Brennus's household comes the following week. The counselor is dying. He is asked to see Nikias. Nikias does not want to go. He goes. Brennus is in a small room in the house of his kinsman, lying on a bed that looks approximately as comfortable as the agoge sleeping surfaces they both graduated from. He is 79 years old and has been reduced by illness to something closer to the truth of him than the political armor usually permits. He, as Nikias sees for the first time, simply a man. Old and finished and afraid in the way that all men are afraid when the account is being settled and the numbers are being examined. He opens his eyes when Nikias enters. Sit down, he says. His voice has lost the quality that used to fill council chambers. It is just a voice now, old and thin and honest. Nikias sits. For a while, Brennus looks at the ceiling. Then he says, I had a son. Nikias waits. You didn't know that? No one knew. He was born when I was very young, before I had risen to the gerousia, before I understood what I was building. He pauses. His breathing is the kind that has a finite number of repetitions remaining. He failed the inspection. The fire in the small room shifts. I carried him to the apathetes myself, Brenna says, because I believed it was right, because I believed everything I told you in that council chamber. Instruments do not feel. The state requires function. The price of Sparta is paid by Sparta's children, and the payment is not optional. Nicias looks at him. I wrote 3 of the policies, Brenna says. The reproductive allocation protocols, the inspection standards, the enforcement procedures for men who resisted the reproductive obligation. I wrote them because I believed in them. He closes his eyes. I still believe in them. That is the worst part. I still believe in the logic even now, even knowing what the logic cost me. Both things are true simultaneously, and I have no idea what to do with that. Nicias is quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? He says. Brennus opens his eyes. He looks at Nicias with an expression that is for the first time in 40 years of acquaintance completely unarmored. Because you were the only one who ever asked, he says, in that council chamber. You asked if Petra agreed. You were the only man in 30 years of administering that policy who asked that question. And I gave you the answer I had been trained to give. But I have thought about that question ever since. Nicias stands up. He looks at Brennus for a long time. There are things he could say, accusations he could make, grief he could perform, condemnation he could deliver that would be both fully deserved and completely pointless. The old man on the bed has already been punished by the machinery he built. The mechanic never escapes his machine. I hope it was worth it to you, Nicias says quietly. I genuinely don't know if it was worth it to me. He walks out. Brennus dies 2 days later. The Gerousia notes his passing in their records and assigns his council seat to a younger man. The system continues. The orders for Judas come in the last weeks of autumn, a major engagement, the kind that the Gerousia describes in the particular language it uses for operations, where casualty projections are significant. The language is exact and honest in its way. Spartan institutions are rarely dishonest about military mathematics. They simply do not consider the mathematics to be a reason for hesitation. Judas receives the orders with the equanimity of a trained warrior, processing them as operational data to be acted upon. He comes to see Nicias the evening before the departure. They sit at the same table where Nicias told him about the morning with Akara, and for a while they talk about the campaign, the way soldiers talk terrain and weather, and the known capabilities of opposing forces. Judas asks good questions. His tactical thinking is precise and original in the way that the best Dogoje training produces men who follow orders, but understand them deeply enough to improvise intelligently when orders break down. Nicias watches him talk and thinks about the 7-year-old standing in the courtyard with his small bundle, the jaw set like his mother's jaw, the eyes that did not look back. I want to say something, Nicias says when the tactical discussion has run its course. Judas looks at him. I was not there enough, Nicias says. He lets the sentence stand by itself without defense or context, or the qualifications that Spartan training makes habitual. No, because the state required. No, the system did not permit. Just the bare, unarmored fact. I was not there when you were small, when your mother was ill. I was not there for the things that required me to be present, and I told myself this was correct, and I was wrong. The room is very quiet. Judas looks at his father for a long time. He has the face of a man hearing words in a language he was never formally taught, but understands through some deeper channel than instruction, the channel that runs beneath all the architecture the Agoge installed down to the original material of the person who was handed to the state at 7 years old and was never entirely absorbed by it. I know, Judas says, 2 words, unelaborated, not an accusation, not a forgiveness, simply the acknowledgement that the statement is true, that it has been known to be true by both of them for a long time, and that the knowing has been part of the structure of their relationship, the way an old fracture becomes part of the structure of stone. It runs through defining the shape without ending the stone's usefulness. Nicias nods. They sit for a while longer. They do not talk about the campaign again. They do not talk about Kara or Lycus or Brennus or any of the large things that have accumulated over 42 years of a life lived inside a system that was never designed for large things. They simply sit, 2 men at a table, in something that is not quite peace but is closer to it than either of them has been in a very long time. In the morning, Nicias walks to the city gate to watch the column form up. He finds a position on the stone wall where he can see clearly, and he watches the warriors assemble in the early light with the precision of men for whom formation is a physical reflex. He finds Eudes in the column without difficulty. His son stands in the line with the same economy of motion. Nicias watched him walk through the gate with a week ago the same calibrated stillness of a trained instrument. And Nicias thinks watching him about that word, instrument, about Brennus using it in the council chamber with such certainty, such genuine conviction, that the word was complete, that it captured everything necessary about what a Spartan man was. What Brennus never understood, what perhaps neither of them fully understood until this moment, is that instruments do not know they are instruments. The boy who was handed to the state at 7 and shaped by 12 years of systematic pressure and another 15 of active service is still beneath all of that engineering the boy who was handed over. Still the person who existed before the shaping began. Still capable in some fundamental and inarticulate way of standing in a column on an autumn morning and being something more than the sum of his military specifications. The column begins to move. Nicias watches his son's back as the formation passes through the gate and onto the road beyond. He watches until the last man in the column has passed through and the gate stands empty and the sound of ordered marching has faded into the distance. He does not say the words. The famous words, the words every Spartan mother and father is supposed to say, the ritual invocation that is passed down through generations as the distilled essence of Spartan values. Return with your shield or on it. He does not say them. He said them to Lycus once in a different form on a different morning, and he knows now what those words actually mean. They mean that the person you love is required to mean less to you than the state. They mean that even at the moment of possible final parting, the correct response is a slogan. Nicias has said enough slogans. He stands at the empty gate for a while after the column is gone. Then he walks back through the city to the house that has been his official residence for 23 years, the house where Kara died while he was on campaign, the house where Eudes stood with his small bundle at 7 years old on the morning Nicias placed a hand briefly on his head. He sits down. The house is very quiet. There are no duties waiting, no civic obligations scheduled, no training requirements, no reproductive allocations, no council summons. For the first time in 42 years, Nicias sits in a room with nothing required of him. He looks at his hands. The hands of a Spartan warrior are a kind of autobiography written in scar tissue and old muscle and the permanent calluses of decades of grip. He looks at them and he thinks about everything they have done, everything they have held, everything they have let go of. And he asks the question that he has been building toward for 42 years without knowing it. Was it worth it? He sits with the question. He does not answer it quickly because the quick answer is either the trained answer or the broken answer. And he is tired of trained answers and not yet ready to be broken. He sits with it the way he sat with Kara at that table 23 years ago, in the darkness before dawn, without agenda, without function, just present with something too large and too quiet for easy words. He does not reach a conclusion, but he does not look away from the question either. And after 42 years of a life built on the principle that looking away from difficulty was the only way to survive it, the decision not to look away feels in its small and private way like the most Spartan thing he has ever done. Sparta will reach its greatest military power in 404 BC, 38 years from this autumn morning, when a warrior sits alone in a stone house and looks at his hands. It will conquer Athens. It will stand at the apex of the Greek world and survey a dominion purchased with exactly the kind of human currency that Nicias spent his entire life paying. And then in 371 BC at the Battle of Leuctra, a Theban general named Epaminondas will destroy the Spartan army with a tactical formation so elegant, so simple that military historians will spend the next 2 millennia studying it. The Spartan force at Leuctra numbers fewer than 1,000 citizen warriors. At the height of Spartan power, that number had been 8,000. They did not lose those 7,000 men to enemy armies. They lost them to their own system. The mathematical reduction of the Spartan warrior class, the phenomenon the Greeks called oliganthropy, the shortage of men, was the direct result of policies built on the precise logic that Brennus explained to Nicias in the council chamber. The eugenics programs, the removal of children from families, the systematic destruction of domestic attachment, the criminalization of childlessness, the reproductive allocation protocols. All of these things implemented with brilliant efficiency over generations produced a population of men who were the finest individual warriors the ancient world had ever seen, and who generation by generation produced fewer and fewer children, not because they were physically incapable, because the system had removed from them with extraordinary thoroughness every reason to want to continue it. The men trained to feel nothing about their families felt nothing about their families. The men trained to view children as civic instruments rather than as human beings, they loved produce fewer civic instruments. The men told from age 7 that attachment was weakness, learned eventually not to be attached to anything, including Sparta itself. The perfect weapon destroyed its own maker. This is the story of Nicaeus, who was not a famous man who won no battles significant enough for historians to record, who lived and trained and sacrificed inside a system of such comprehensive genius that it manufactured its own collapse from the very qualities it prized most. He was loyal beyond the capacity of loyalty to sustain itself. He was obedient past the point where obedience and dignity can coexist. He was an instrument for so long and so completely that the man beneath the instrument had to conduct his most fundamental conversations, his most necessary acts of connection, in the brief dark windows between duties at tables before dawn, at city gates after columns had passed. He may have been the last man who asked whether any of it was worth it and actually waited for an honest answer. The answer, if there is one, lives in the silence between Eudys's footsteps on the road out of the city. It lives in the 20 minutes at a table before dawn. It lives in the weight of a hand on a 7-year-old boy's head, brief and insufficient and real, the most human moment in a life designed to have none. Whether that is enough is a question that every man in every age in every city that has ever demanded everything and promised meaning in return must eventually sit alone and answer for himself.